In the Perspectrum podcast, we discuss controversial topics. Outside of this context, Michael and I are both working professionals. While doing the show, we are not acting as agents or representatives of our respective institutions, and none of the views that we express reflect the outlooks of our employers. So don't come to my office and throw toilet paper at me.
And I don't have an office, but don't come to my cube.
Welcome to the Perspectrum. I'm Nathan Seelove.
And I'm Michael Bloom.
And today we have a very different episode. We have a special episode. We're not going to be talking about anything super political. We're just going to be talking about something super political.
Is it the episode that gets us canceled?
No. We are officially doing this episode to wage an all-out war on Christmas.
Hasta la vista, Christmas. Yeah, so this is our Christmas special episode. Usually we do something a little bit different related to Christmas, but this year we're talking about, the history and the traditions, and the reason we're doing this, which is semi-political, and that's because Christmas isn't any one thing. It's not any one bundle of traditions. It's celebrated in different ways throughout the world. It's celebrated, there are tons of wintertime holidays, not just Christmas. And it's not even that Christian of a holiday, historically speaking. And so the real thesis is make it, or Christmas or the holiday season or wintertime in general, the thing that works for you. Yeah. Because any prescription around Christmas is just kind of absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, you can almost call this entire episode just one big tip for good.
Yeah. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Because here's the thing. Michael and I are both fairly secular people, but we both still celebrate Christmas.
Yeah.
And that is okay. Right? The big thesis here is you do you. All right? In my opinion, it's just as ridiculous for someone to get offended when someone says Happy Holidays than it is for someone to get offended when someone says Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
All right. If you don't celebrate Christmas, that's great. If you do celebrate Christmas, that's also great. It doesn't make you morally superior or inferior to celebrate Christmas or to not celebrate Christmas.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, totally. And I did want to say one thing about the comparison of those two things. When you celebrate Christmas and you say Merry Christmas to someone who doesn't, all you're doing is saying, marry this season that I celebrate, or marry this thing that I celebrate. And when you say happy holidays, you're saying happy this thing that you might celebrate. Those are just two sides of pretty much the same coin, but you are saying slightly different things, based on your position and their position to the holiday that you're trying to tell them to have a good one of.
Yeah. And I'll even throw a little bone to the Merry Christmas defenders for a second. You know how people are always saying oh, you got to do the secular version of it and say Happy Holidays. All right. Holiday actually comes from the term for holy day. So when somebody who is secular thinks they're being secular by saying Happy Holiday, what they're saying is Happy Holy Day. So they're not being secular. Yeah. So there's a little bone for you.
Yeah. Yeah, which is funny because I think this ties us to a little maybe a secondary thesis, which is assume people are assume good intent, right?
Yeah, exactly.
People are not trying to say fuck you by saying Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays.
Exactly.
In any context. So there's no sense getting all, frustrated by a warm greeting like that.
Yeah. So without further ado, let's talk about the history of Christmas. Now, when I first sat down to start researching this, I already knew a few things about the overall history of Christmas. I knew generally that a lot of the traditions came from a lot of Germanic pagan cultures. Holy shit, though. The entire, the history of various different Christmas celebrations is so difficult to nail down.
Yeah.
The version that I'm going to be presenting is what I've been able to piece together. And I'm sure that there are some aspects of it that I might be leaving out. I'm sure that there are some people out there that might say, hey, you left out this part of this. What about this? Or you were wrong about this. I'm trying as best I can, but keep in mind, a lot of this history is history from like the early 3rd century.
Yeah, that was one of the things that struck me about this. Like, not only in how difficult it was to put together, to try to cobble together a history, but also the fact that like people have been celebrating some version of a winter holiday for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And there's like, and Christianity did this attempt to, maybe take over many of those or co-opt some of those traditions or whatever. But like a lot of those traditions still survive through to today. And the thing is like, yeah, the celebration has morphed a lot over the time, but I was struck by like this tradition is older than Christianity.
Oh yeah, much older.
By far, because it makes sense, right? Like the shortest day of the year is in December. The length of the day is an important thing intrinsically to like all animals. And like it just makes sense for us to have these holidays around this period. And so like it's just a significant period.
Yeah. So the first question though is, when was Jesus actually born? Was he actually born on Christmas? And definitely not.
Yeah.
Like there is absolutely no fucking way that he was actually born on December the 25th. And even if he was born on December the 25th, in today's calendar, you should be celebrating January 6th instead of December 25th.
Wait a second. Is that what all the insurrectionists were really doing?
Yeah, that's what they were doing. They were celebrating the birth of Jesus. Yeah. Which we'll get to that. We'll get to why a little bit later, but it's crazy. So the Bible doesn't specifically say when Jesus was born, but there's some context that it gives around various festivals that we do know when they were. So we can kind of discern approximately when the birth would have happened based on that. For example, there's a Jewish festival, and I know I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Sukkot, definitely pronouncing that incorrectly. And there's also the Feast of Tabernacles, again, probably saying that incorrectly. And those are the festivals that are mentioned the most times in the Bible when it mentions the birth story. Now, those take place specifically in September or October.
Interesting.
It's actually specifically focused on the end of the harvest. All right. It's a celebration focused on the end of the harvest, which means that the most likely date that Jesus's birth would have fallen on, based on what they actually talk about in the Bible, would have been one of the 3 major feasts of Sukkoth, which was also called Tabernacles or Booths. Again, there's a lot. This is going to be a theme for a lot of it. There's a lot of really fancy names for things. But anyway, that happened in September. So based on the references to various Jewish festivals in the Bible, Jesus was most likely born sometime in September.
Yeah,
so
I think this is a really interesting point, because like if a particular date or event is very important to a religion, you write it down.
Yeah, exactly.
But like that's just not the case for the birth of Christ. Like Easter, quote unquote, for the December 25th holiday. Easter was the big celebration. Makes sense. He actually did that, apparently. And his birth really wasn't like a thing. For like a good 400 or so years after, he died, like it wasn't really like that celebrated. And in fact, in only 2 of the 27 books of the New Testament is his birth mentioned at all.
Yeah. Then why the hell would they decide to put the day on the 25th? So there's a lot of different possibilities, but the most likely reason seems to be that is when the Romans celebrated the solstice, right? At the time, the solstice, the Romans believed, was on the 25th. Yeah. Now, the reason why I say the Romans believed is because the calendar wasn't entirely stable back then. So some years it might have fallen on the 25th, some years it might not have fallen on the 25th, and it certainly doesn't fall on the 25th anymore. Part of the reason why we have a better idea of when the solstice falls now is because of the Gregorian calendar that was able to stabilize the Roman calendar. But we'll get to that a little bit more later. So solstice was celebrated by various different cultures. It was celebrated by the Romans. It was celebrated by the Greeks. It was celebrated by the Celts. It was celebrated by the Druids. It was celebrated by the Norse.
Mm-hmm.
And they all had various different traditions that, as I read through them, some of them sound interestingly familiar. For example, the idea of Yule, the word Yule that gets thrown around during the Christmas
as
season.
in Yuletide log.
Exactly. The Yuletide log. So the original word comes from apparently the Norse word for wheel, because they looked at the year as basically this wheel that was constantly spinning around. The Yule log was something that the Celts would do. The idea was they believed that the solstice lasted for 12 days. Like that the earth would just stay still and the sun would just stay still for 12 days. So what you would do is you would take this big Yule log, you would put it in the fire, and you would burn it for 12 days. And as long as you kept that burning, that was the light in the darkness. Because keep in mind, the solstice is the longest night of the year.
Yeah, especially as you go further north.
Yeah. So it looks like that might be where we get the idea of the 12 days of Christmas. But of course, we might also get that from the fact that some people, even today, celebrate Christmas as January 6th, and some people celebrate it as December 25th. So it looks like some cultures just kind of split the difference and said, let's just say it's all 12 days, 12 of those days between. So again, it's confusing to me, but a lot of these traditions are ones that we can look at and actually kind of see parallels between what we do today.
Yeah,
so
there's even for the Romans.
Yeah, even for the Romans.
They exchanged gifts, sang songs, decorated their homes with evergreens. All of like the things that somehow survived thousands of years.
Yeah. And also, I thought this was kind of interesting. In Germany, the god Odin was honored during the winter holiday, specifically because people were terrified of him, because they thought that he would make nighttime flights through the sky and observe his people. You might say he could see when they're sleeping and know when they're awake.
Yeah, that was super interesting reading about the Norse implications of Santa Claus.
Yeah. But then, of course, instead of giving them presents, if they were bad, he would just kill them.
Sure. I mean, we're talking
Which is
about
interesting
Norse
because
here.
because Futurama actually does that. Futurama actually kind of makes a reference to that. Michael mentioned in Rome, there was the festival of Saturnalia. Saturn was the god of agriculture, and they would celebrate it by having these massive festivals where up was down, left was right. The men would dress as women. The slaves would be seen as equals to rich people. Rich people would have to basically give up their power for a few days. It was basically a massive celebration where the working class could have a little bit of a taste of aristocracy.
Okay, that is such another interesting thread of this whole story. Like that those traditions in Rome, and then and we'll get to like some of the later traditions, but this theme shows up again.
Yeah. The decorating of the evergreen tree, that comes from Germanic tribes. And interestingly enough, nowadays in America, we think of Christmas as being this happy family time, kind of calm, have dinner. In the Middle Ages, it was basically Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
Like it was the time where people would just go absolutely nuts, get drunk off their ass, just have fun, eat as much as they possibly could. And each year, a student or a beggar would be crowned the Lord of Misrule. Like that was a coveted position. Rich people would get visits to their houses from the poor, who would demand their best food and their best drink, and they would be terrorized if they didn't comply. So again, this was a huge deal for the working class people.
Yeah. It became this time of year when like the upper classes would like repay their kind of debt to society by entertaining the like poor people throughout their cities, which is, I just want to emphasize that the amount of history we're talking about here. Like, the Romans had this like reversal of positions and kind of class upheaval in the pre-Christ era, like BC. And then we're talking about Dark Ages, which is like, 1200. We're talking about like 1200 years later or more that these traditions of like class reversal survived and showed up again in like thousands, like 1,000+ years later. It's remarkable.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely crazy. So the biggest reason why, based on what I've been able to piece together, the biggest reason why Christians adopted this specific time of year is because it was already a time of year of celebration.
Yeah.
People loved their solstice festivities. All right. And there's a lot of important reasons why you would. I mean, think about it. It's the time of the year where it's the last day where the nights are going to get longer, which means that from the solstice on, the days will get longer. All right. You'll have longer and longer days. Now, people experience a lot of seasonal depression. They did back then too.
Yeah.
So the idea of celebrating the solstice was basically a pick-me-up.
Totally.
Right. It was a pick-me-up. It was also around the time of year in which the fermenting of beer would be, ready
finish.
for consumption, would
No
be finished.
way. It's it. So they had the Harvest Festival, and then they had the Get Drunk Beer Festival.
Yeah. And on top of harvest, this was also the time of year in which you would have the most readily available fresh meat because you would have to slaughter a lot of your animals before the winter because you don't want to have to feed them in the winter. All right. So you go ahead and slaughter your animals now.
Yeah.
So that they're not going into your winter storage. So you had a fuck ton of fresh meat that you had to eat. So this was the perfect time to have some type of festivities. And that's probably why a lot of cultures that were loosely connected, but not completely connected, like not, immediately connected, had a similar type of celebration throughout this exact same time period.
Yeah. Which
so,
it led to this like interesting trade-off. So apparently you can trace like the first, like the selection of like the date of Christmas to apparently Pope Julius I, who chose the 25th. So, but they face this interesting conundrum, to Nathan's point, because it's like, on the one hand, you could like ride on the rails, you could ride the wave of a celebratory period that everybody's already celebrating and try to spread your specific religious celebration via that channel. But on the other hand, people already have many traditions that are very diverse that they cling to. So you kind of give up some control over what kind of celebration it will be in order to, help wrap your, package in that celebration's, wrapping, to use a Christmas metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. So it made a lot more sense for them to just kind of be like, hey, pagans, what up? So we really want you to be Christian. So how's about this, bros? All right. You can keep doing literally everything you're doing. Just, briefly throw in there, hey, we're totally doing this for this Jesus guy. And all these pagans were like, who? Jesus. Who? He's the Son of God. Oh, the Son. Yeah, we're celebrating the Son. Okay, fuck it. That's it. We're celebrating that. There you go. Good enough. That's how the conversation went in my head.
It was a linguistic trick. Like they were just
Well, honestly,
mistaken.
It kind of looks like that, because like it's about the celebration of the sun coming back.
Yeah.
Which, Christmas is about the celebration of the
sun coming back.
So
that's really funny.
So, I mean, I don't know if that was, I don't know if that's a no pun intended moment, but that's kind of an interesting how that worked out.
That is so funny.
So I keep making references to the Gregorian calendar. All right. So the Julian calendar was originally created by the Romans and it was named after Julius Caesar. Now, what's funny is that he has his own month named after him, July, and it has 31 days. But his son also wanted one named after him. Remember, Augustus Caesar? He also wanted a month named after him. So he went ahead and threw in his own name, which was August. which was for August, but he also wanted his month to have the same number of days. So like the way it used to be was months would kind of go, 30, 31, 30, 31, but he wanted his to have 31 days like Julius Caesar's did.
Are you telling me that the reason that we have this weird like switching up of the pattern is because of one dude's like ego in competition with his dad?
It's a huge part of it. Yes.
That fucking sucks.
Yeah. On top of, that's why a lot of the months are named after, like you can hear a number in them. September should be the 7th month.
Yeah.
October should be the 8th month. November should be the 9th month.
Yeah.
December should be the 10th month. But then Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar threw in their own months in there. And
Holy
we're just
shit,
like,
a 10-month
fuck
calendar
this
would
system.
make so much more sense. They literally
would.
started all of this. They were like, in my mind, like you can trace a direct line from them, like all the way through like the imperial system, and in parallel you have the metric system, which is like base 10 and scientific, and on the other hand you got like 12 inches in a foot and 12 months in a year and 60 seconds in an hour and 24 hours in a day, all this absurd shit just because of these two fucking fuckers. That's it. That's now a thread in my mind. That's how that happened.
Yeah. It completely threw off the calendar, like completely fucked over the calendar. And actually it had more days than it needed to, which meant that the calendar for hundreds and hundreds of years was just all over the place. It was super unstable.
Oh my God.
That changed when Pope Gregory VIII created the Gregorian calendar in 1582. So the Julian calendar was used prior to that. This was more accurate because, number one, it just decided to eliminate 10 days. Like when it started, the day went from October 4th to October 15th. So it just said, we're getting rid of these 10 days because they completely fucked it up. But then they also created the leap year, the idea of a leap year. So
oh my gosh,
because
so weird.
the average year has 365 and about a quarter days in it. Every 4 years, you go ahead and have a leap year, right? But of course, it's a little bit less than and a quarter, which means that every 100 years, they skip the leap year. But then they had to make another exception in order to further stabilize it. So they said every 1,000 years, you have an exception to the exception, and you do have a leap year.
Oh my God. And
this work of genius actually stabilized the calendar.
Jesus Christ.
But because of all of that had been thrown off, this meant that the solstice was now usually on the 21st. What would have been the original celebration of Christmas was now on January 6th. But of course, they didn't want to change the date of the birth, so they just kept it at the 25th.
Interesting. Wow.
So basically, it was all over the place.
Just fucking calendar math.
For centuries. Yeah.
That is remarkable.
It was all over the place for fucking centuries. So that's why Christmas is on the 25th.
Wow.
Even though the solstice is on the 21st, most
though
years,
Christ was probably born in the fall.
Yeah. And even though originally it would have been celebrated for today's version of January 6th, but Christ was actually born in September, most likely. Yeah. So
okay, so all of that history like leads us to the fact clearly that like this is honestly, the Christian part of this holiday is like a pretty political one. It's like more about evangelizing people and taking over their holidays than it is about like Christianity in general, although maybe we can make the argument that those things are pretty related. But all this to say, like the traditions and stuff, which have persisted a lot over time, like are not particularly Christian traditions. So much so that in the 17th century in England, when they were still doing the shit that they had put together in Rome, like people getting drunk, gender bending, roaming the streets, knocking doors, demanding to be fed. All this shit was still happening in the 17th century, and pissed people off so much that it was actually banned in England for a while, during like when the Puritans had like some control in England, and then that followed Puritanism to be banned in the United States.
Yeah, it was outlawed in Boston from 1659 to 1681.
Yeah.
You could be fined 5 shillings for showing Christmas spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about a war on Christmas.
Yeah, but I mean, honestly, it's kind of funny because like the war on Christmas was really the war on like trying to calm people the fuck down.
Yeah.
So they weren't having this like over the top festival, which was so funny. But like, so then, after the bans ended, because again, one of the most amazing and persistent parts of this history is when people have tried to, calm it down or lied over it, like many of the really strong celebratory traditions of the period lived on, and people would do them in private. People would be frustrated that they would be fucking, thrown in jail or fined for celebrating. And eventually like these bans would go away, which is really interesting because this is where we kind of tie it back into like the thread of, classism kind of like getting mixed up during the Christmas period. So in the US in the 1800s, right, Christmas started to transform into closer to what we know it as today. So gift giving was like either reintroduced or became more popular. It became like more of about quiet celebration and like about like peace and nostalgia and all these things. Partially because during the 19th century, just before it kind of calmed down, we were seeing like people were, having these raucous celebrations and all that stuff. But at the same time, during the 19th century, there was a lot of like turmoil. There was a lot of class division and inequality, and people were starting riots over Christmas. And so apparently the upper class started to intentionally attempt to transform Christmas in popular minds into this peace, gift-giving, nostalgic holiday. And one of the ways they did that was by convincing people in the US that the way the people in England did it was this proper, peaceful method of celebrating Christmas. So it was literally like, we think of commercialization of Christmas today, but this was literally the upper class going, hey, calm it down, all you like lower class partiers, like,
Yeah.
and they're the ones
And also
that ultimately
a lot
succeeded.
of those traditions came from immigrants too.
Yeah.
Like when immigrants from various different countries would come to America, like especially ones that came from Germany or the Netherlands, they would bring their traditions with them.
Yeah.
And Americans would see that and be like, "Oh, that sounds great." Like you party in the streets and you demand shit from rich people? I want some of that.
Yeah. And then you could imagine though, like you can imagine all the social pressure of assimilating into the US and trying to like, put pressure on people to live like, do these like American type celebrations.
Yeah. I also want to make sure that we spend some time talking about Kris Kringle.
Absolutely.
Santa Claus. Because I find his story as a leftist to be so wonderful. I mean, first off, on its face, who is Santa Claus? He's this dude that, out of the kindness of his heart, gives handouts to children all over the world just because he wants to. All right. Just because he thinks that all kids deserve to have gifts, to be happy. Right.
No, he does it to make them fat and lazy.
And he wears red to boot. What a communist.
Yeah.
So the idea behind Santa Claus actually derives from, I know that you've probably heard of Saint Nick, heard him referred to as Saint Nick. So there is a legend of a man who was born in Turkey in the year 280, named Saint Nick, or Saint Nicholas. And there's like 30 different ways in which that's been translated, and eventually we just kind of landed on Santa Claus. So like St. Nicholas, Santa Claus. And he was this dude who lost both of his parents, and they were monumentally wealthy. And so he inherited all of that wealth, and he was just like, you know what? I'm just going to take all of this shit and I'm just going to give it to the poor. And that's what he did. He basically gave all of his wealth to go around the countryside, helping poor people, helping sick people, just being a charitable dude. Now, there's definitely some disagreement as to whether or not how much the legend was based on an actual person, or whether he actually existed, or whether this might have just been a few people, or whatnot. But that's the legend that Santa Claus is based off of. You don't get much more socialist than that.
No kidding.
He is a guy who became rich due to inheritance, and he used it to give back to the community. Now, remind me again why Republicans are the ones that care so much about preserving Christmas, this holiday celebrating the birth of a socialist whose traditions were created by a bunch of pagans.
Yeah.
And which is also celebrated by another socialist who rides around on a sleigh being pulled by reindeer, giving kids presents for free. Like,
you know why, Nathan?
What's Republican about that?
You know why? Parents, if you're listening and you have kids that can also overhear, which they shouldn't because we curse a lot on this show. But if they can, just turn off the podcast now. You know why, Nathan? Because Santa Claus doesn't exist. And as a result of that, it means that parents are cornered into buying a bunch of fucking shit for their kids and for everybody else in their lives. Republicans are for it because it causes people to give their money to rich people. It's exactly because of what the upper class did in the 1800s in the U.S. It is exactly the fucking opposite.
So
of what it was supposed to be.
What I'm saying is that if you really do want to be traditional when it comes to Christmas, what you should be doing is you should be going to Elon Musk's house with your kid and saying, "Hey, Dick,"
harassing him until he gives you his best food and wine.
Exactly, and buys presents for your kids.
Yeah,
that's what you should be doing.
Absolutely.
That is celebrating the true meaning of Christmas.
Take that, Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk.
And Jeff Bezos. That's what So my point is, the history of Christmas is very well steeped in paganism.
Yep.
And also in fighting against classism. It is an anthem for the working class to rise up against their oppressors and demand better.
Yeah.
This is totally a leftist holiday.
Yeah,
Everything about the traditions surrounding Christmas is about letting loose, is about hedonism, is about
having enough.
Fighting against classism. It's about having enough.
Yeah.
And appreciating that and enjoying that.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. It's like amazing learning. Like I wasn't like trying to get to a conclusion when I started reading about the history of Christmas. Like I knew there was some paganism in there, but I wasn't trying to be like looking for like, ooh, classist undertones. But like they really were there.
Yeah,
they were really present in so much of this history. And like you're absolutely right. It's like it's so unrelated to the Christmas that people try to force on other people today. Yeah. And that brings me to like another really important point, I think, about Christmas celebrations and all like holiday celebrations during this period, which is like, well, one, there are many holiday celebrations during this period, partially because of the exact same reason why there are so many holiday traditions that are part of Christmas. Because the winter solstice, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, wintertime and the shortest day of the year are really culturally important, culturally significant days. And so there are many celebrations, some of which have been rolled up into Christmas and some of which not, which center around this period, but also many celebrations kind of unrelated to the solstice, which center around this period. And the second piece is that like no two Christmases are alike. You know, like Christmas is celebrated as a national holiday in 160 out of 195 countries, so 82% of countries, with 20 other countries having significant populations that also celebrate Christmas, though it's not a national holiday. So 92% of countries have people who celebrate Christmas, right? And even in the U.S., you go to a your friend's house for Christmas, it's totally different from yours, right? Like they have different traditions. They open presents at another time of day. Some of them don't get presents. Some of them do Santa Claus. Some of them don't. Like some of them, like in my wife's family, for example, her mom never liked Santa Claus. He got all the credit for the presents. So they don't do Santa Claus at all. Their snowman is like the decoration in their house. But like around the world, traditions are super different. In Ethiopia, people fast for 40 days before Christmas, which is exactly the opposite of what we do in the United States. In Mexico, like they have the day off, and there are over 30 traditions that are only found in Mexico surrounding Christmas, including going door to door to like mimic like Jesus and Mary, like going door to door with like the unborn Jesus and all that stuff. In Uruguay, it's they have strict separation of the state from religion. So like it's called Family Day. And even though there are lots of like Christian underpinnings and like it's also known as like Navidad and all that stuff, they celebrate in almost an entirely secular manner. And in Japan, they celebrate Christmas like ish stuff during Christmas time purely for the commercial aspect, right? Like they don't actually celebrate Christmas per se, but they exchange gifts and they have like traditional Christmas cake that they eat. And literally due to an ad campaign from KFC, fried chicken and like chicken meals are like the most popular dish during Christmas, which means that the stores literally take reservations months in advance for fried chicken.
Oh God.
It's like there like no two Christmases are alike. And and during the same period we have Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, Las Posadas, which is a Spanish celebration, which is they have in some places in Mexico and Guatemala. There are other celebrations, like not only during December, but other times in the winter, like Eid al-Adha and Diwali, and like a bunch of other celebrations. And so all this to say that not only is your Christmas not like anybody else's, your holiday season might not be like anybody else's. And while you may receive tons of traditions from people all over the world, because holiday traditions during that period and in general borrow from cultures over time and change and evolve throughout history. But like all of this goes to say, like, our traditions are special and significant and important to all of us individually, which means that tolerance is probably the most important tradition of Christmas.
Yeah. Make it your own.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what America did.
Yeah.
Like America took various different influences from various different cultures throughout world history, and we just created our own version of the holiday. All right? That's what we did. There's nothing objective about it. That's just how we culturally developed. And of course, to Michael's point, different families within America celebrate Christmas differently. For some families, it's the tradition of as soon as you wake up, children rush for their presents. In my family, it was a huge deal that we all had breakfast together as a family.
Yeah.
And then we could have presents.
Yep.
For some families, you can open up a present, like one present on Christmas Eve, and then the rest like later. Some families, again, also like mine, no, you cannot do that. It is, we do it as a family and we don't do it until after we've eaten. And also it was a tradition for my dad to make oyster stew for breakfast every Christmas. I don't know what is so festive about that, but that was the tradition and it was fucking delicious.
I love that. See, that's the most amazing thing. Like, no matter how weird and arbitrary the tradition, I'm not saying oyster stew is a weird tradition. I've just
no, it's a weird tradition. I love it, but it's a weird tradition.
no matter like all traditions, not all of them, many traditions are arbitrary, but we cling to them. We really think they're very important. I defend with vigor my family's holiday traditions. But
Yeah.
I would never try to force someone else to have the same ones. The one in my family that I think is the most funny is that no one is allowed to go downstairs to look at the tree or the presents or anything until my dad has put on his pants and gotten the coffee.
Interesting.
So literally we had this,
Interesting.
like literally we would wake up early in the morning throughout my childhood, and literally through, like, even as a teenager, you'd wake up early and no one could go downstairs. You'd have this long, drawn-out process where you'd have to wake up my dad, who's been up until like midnight or later the night before, not only wrapping, but then putting out all the, presents and stuff, right? And then he would take like at least half an hour to put on his black jeans, which he always wears. Put on his black jeans and go down and make a pot of coffee. Literally, all of us are like antsy as fuck, standing upstairs, like biting our nails, and no one can go downstairs. And then he comes up and he gets a cup of coffee, and my mom gets a cup of coffee, and we line up oldest to youngest. The youngest goes at the back, and then we walk downstairs. And like that is a tradition which has now spanned multiple, like now is like my nieces and nephews. So another generation now observes the same tradition.
Wow.
And it's so weird and it's so arbitrary, and I absolutely love it. And we're going to do it forever.
Yeah. Another kind of weird and arbitrary thing. I wasn't allowed to, like, we weren't allowed to open the presents until after breakfast had been made and after we ate breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
But as a kid, I was so excited to open stuff up and like to be around and to see the spread that the one thing my parents would let me do would be to sort the presents. So I would always be the one that sorted
Nathan
them
thing I've ever heard.
and distributed them. So of course, when my mother would put them under the tree, she would make sure to spread them all over the place, mix them up so that I could then sort them. And still
so
today,
sweet.
I'm usually like, I don't sort them like that, but I'm the one that hands them to people. I'm the one that delivers them.
That was always my job too.
Yeah. And like, it's an arbitrary thing, but there are reasons behind it.
Yeah.
That we made our own.
Yeah.
So the big point of this entire of this podcast episode is just make it your own and be okay with that. All right? Stop politicizing this. The only way in which Christmas should be politicized is as a rallying call for the working class against the rich, because that's traditionally what it's supposed to be. All right. If you want to politicize Christmas, you should politicize it to the extent that you should be going to Jeff Bezos's house and demanding that he give you food, like his best food, and that he give you presents like that. That's the only way you should be politicizing it. Besides that, don't politicize it. If people don't celebrate it, like, whatever.
Yeah.
If people do celebrate it, whatever. If someone says Merry Christmas, then say back whatever you think is the appropriate response. If someone says Happy Holidays, say back whatever you think is the appropriate response. What I always do is I just repeat what they said. All right. No matter what they say, I just repeat what they said.
Yeah.
I have
Same goes when someone honks at me in traffic or says "fuck you."
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Treat holiday holiday greetings the same way that you treat when someone says "fuck you."
Yeah. And with that, thank you so much for listening to the Perspectrum's holiday special, and Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.